Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about battles in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires and about battles in Total War in general and the problems that exist with them and what could be done to fix them. Now here I am in my Deathmaster Snitch campaign. I uploaded the first video of this on YouTube. This is at the very end of that video. This is where I ended that particular video. And one of the things I've realized playing Immortal Empires as I do is how meaningless a lot of the battles are. And if the battles are meaningless, then they're less interesting. A lot of the times when we talk about the issues in battles, we think about the mechanics of the battles, like the towers and barricades in siege battles, for instance, or the poor AI decision making, etc. But I think the issue is different than that. I think the issue in a lot of Total War battles is that the vast majority of battles you will be fighting in a campaign are irrelevant. Not irrelevant in the sense that winning them is not important in your campaign. Obviously winning territory, defeating enemy armies is consequential, but the actual fighting itself is relatively pointless. Anyone with a decent grasp of tactics that is familiar with this game will have a fairly easy time dealing with battles in Warhammer 3. And the reason is the power creep that does exist in armies as things currently stand. So for instance here, I have an army under Deathmaster Snitch. This is a pretty good early game army. Yes, this is still the early game, turn 34. It's got the bunch of gutter runners, slingers, night runners, and night runners with singles, as well as some of the starting units, Session Triads, Warp Grinders, and Poisoned Wind Mortars, as well as an assassin, a warlock engineer, and a chieftain. This army is not really hard to acquire. In fact, you can do so within the first 10 turns or so. Although the ranks on the units and the ranks on the heroes, that is a different discussion. However, this army, you would be hard-pressed to find a worthy foe for this army in the entire campaign. And as I play through the campaign, as I replace some of these units, like I replace these night runners with gutter runners or death runners, I get more artillery, it will become even more powerful. Indeed, in a lot of campaigns I've played in Immortal Empires, and I'm not the only one, we do get to a point very quickly and without too much stress where our main army, our Legendary Lord army, is unstoppable until much later in the campaign, and only when we meet fellow Legendary Lords that have had time to build a powerful army in their own right to defeat us. The reason this happens is because you are not losing units in battles, because you're fighting them, as opposed to the AI, which has to deal with all the consequences of the piss poor auto result, which is extremely punishing in terms of the casualties incurred. But it's not just the casualties. It's the fact that if you keep an army alive for a very long period of time, these units will become gold, they'll become very powerful, they'll rout far, it will be far more difficult to rout them, and they'll gain a significant amount of combat ability. That's on top of the fact that the Legendary Lord or the Lord themselves does have skills that does significantly buff these units. For instance, for Snitch, he gets a fairly substantial amount of speed, reload time reduction, and that's just one of the base skills, and then later on quite a bit more to that. And that's before counting research, right? Because there is research in the bottom tree that I don't have, but research that would further improve their combat capability. So for night runners and gutter runners, there is Fight Dirty, for instance, one of the earlier skills, that would give them 10% weapon strength. And even later on, we do get different skills. Like there is a skill here that would substantially increase the upkeep of all my units, but would give all my units that are rank 7 or above a substantial amount of melee attack and a substantial amount of melee defense. 20% upkeep, sure, that's substantial, but it would give me a lot of combat power. I think the problem is, as things currently stand, is that if you are, as a player, you obviously will want to protect your units. and you will want to enter a battle and lose no units. In fact, most of the time when I am fighting a battle manually, I'm not doing it to win it, necessarily, unless the auto-resolve is going to say a defeat. But most of the time I'm doing it so that I take fewer casualties and win a more decisive victory. But even if I were to auto-resolve it, and I have auto-resolved most of the battles I fought in this campaign, even if I auto-resolve it, the consequences of taking those casualties from auto-resolve are fairly insignificant, because it's very easy for me to get back on my feet. And it's actually easy for the AI to get back up on its feet, even if it loses everything. It depends on a faction-by-faction basis. For instance, the Tomb Kings, yeah, they'll lose unit ranks, but they have free recruitment. They don't have to pay anything for it. Beastmen, same situation. So outside of losing heroes, they don't even lose the lords themselves if they lose a battle. Outside of losing, though they'll get wounded, outside of losing the units, the unit ranks and the heroes, assuming those heroes don't have Immortal, it will be fairly easy to get back on your feet. Which means that individual battles are very inconsequential in a lot of ways. And winning a battle like this, it doesn't really feel consequential if I'm doing well or doing in a mediocre way, as long as I can have a decent amount of casualty replenishment through an assassin hero here, or for whatever hero or lord that does have a great deal of casualty replenishment. And the vast majority of factions, lords, races do have access to pretty good casualty replenishment. Some of the best races and lords and factions have very high casualty replenishment. Though even with lower casualty replenishment, it still wouldn't matter, because you would be able to recover from a battle, even a poor one, very easily. For instance here, this army here, I lost a battle with it, and I withdrew it, and now I'm back in the field, took out the army that I lost against, some poor tactics on my part, and now I'm moving against Taitsu to take them out, take the territory, and then start expanding westward. The campaign mechanics, I feel, have been improved significantly in Total War over the years. And games like Troy, Free Kingdoms, and even Warhammer Free do have pretty good campaign mechanics by and large. The problem is that this is not just about the campaign. And I have a lot of fun in the campaign, I don't have a lot of fun in battles. I considered for a long time, is it the simplistic tactics or something like that? No. It's that I don't really feel, as a player, that the game is giving me a real incentive to care about individual battles. It does give me a reason to not lose a battle. It does give me a reason to keep my heroes alive, because the power these heroes and lords give is very significant. It actually gets to an absurd level, and I think that this is the first point I want to make. Heroes and lords give too much power to the armies that they're leading or part of. Way too much. Beyond their combat ability, and Snitch himself is an absolutely huge wrecking ball who can go toe-to-toe against some of the strongest legendary lords in individual combat and come out on top, because he's got incredibly powerful stats. Weapon strength, melee attack, melee defense. He's got 85 melee attack. I sent this guy against a lord in a battle, and he killed him in 3 seconds flat, pretty much. Or routed him, rather. And this is not even his final form. In his final form, once I unlock his full combat skill, this guy will be shredding anyone that stands in his way. I understand that legendary lords, special hero, high-level heroes should feel like rewarding. The problem is, there's just too much of it. And this is something that's always been a case in Total War. It's not just their combat ability. Previously, before we had single entities, it was more their army ability. We remember, anyone who's played Medieval 2 would remember the Mongols. But why were the Mongols so fearsome? It wasn't because their combat capability of their units. It was because the guys leading the Mongol armies, had such a high level of dread that your entire army would break and run within seconds. Or very, very quickly, at any rate. You could counter this, of course. You could also use this to your advantage to get a high level of dread to break enemy morale. Now, it's fun, and I do feel that leveling a lord, leveling units should have an impact, but it goes too significantly far, and creates a situation where Creative Assembly can either do two things. One, they don't buff the AI to an extreme level, in which case you get the situation like Immortal Empires, where a lot of the game is boring because we just have that kind of power and we have access to it. Or you create a situation like Warhammer 2, in which the AI gets very huge amounts of experience for their heroes, for their lords, high experience for their armies to try and counter the power that the player has, but then you just end up in the situation where you're fighting an enormous number of battles. And it does get tiring if you're fighting a lot of battles. The battles themselves can be challenging and fun, but even so, you can, using proper tactics, you can overcome that. So some kind of middle ground has to be found. I don't think they found it, but I do think the fundamental issue, and this has been an issue in every Total War game, is that you get so much power with a lord, with an army, that it becomes unstoppable. I'm sure there's many of you who have had many campaigns, or significant portion of the campaigns, where your lord, unless you did poor positioning or you did a bad auto-resolve, that's generally when I've been at risk. When I've done an auto-resolve that caused significant casualties in my army, and then another army showed up and either finished the job or put me at risk. And I had to fight for it. An example of this that I actually put on this channel was playing Mazamundi. I had to resolve the settlement battle, took significant casualties, and then a Norscan army came behind me, and I had to fight. I won. I didn't really lose anything for it, maybe 1 or 2 units. I think it was 2 units. But I did recover fairly quickly from that. So here's my view with regards to that. I think that the power creep of lords needs to be toned down. I understand that in Warhammer, special characters do have significant power. And certainly something like a Bloodthirster, someone like Scarbrand should be a Wrecking Ball. Someone like Snitch should be really powerful. But not to the degree that their entire army is an unstoppable mess. Like, they should be powerful, but not their entire bloody army just by their sheer presence. Unless it's one of those lords that may not have the best combat ability on a personal level, like, say, Catherine, but who can give significant buffs to their own army. That could be a nice middle ground. But yeah, the power creep is very strong, regardless of who you're playing. You could play Craventail for all you care, and yeah, he would also buff his army through the roof. So I think that needs to be toned down in general. Not by limiting how much experience you gain or anything like that, but just by limiting the sheer power potential. There should be some of it, but it should be limited. I'm reminded of the game Ultimate General Civil War, and I was actually thinking about that game quite a bit when I was thinking about this particular subject. In that game, it doesn't matter to level your units and to level your generals. And each unit, each brigade, because you're leading individual brigades, has a commanding officer. Then their divisions have commanding officers. Then the corps has the commanding officer, has the commanding general. And each of those gives significant stat boost to an army, but it's not so significant that that without them, and there's not so many ranks that a level 1 unit would just get shredded without any kind of problem. So I think that's something that should change. Another thing I want to mention is with regards to casualty replenishment, because I do think that the system of replenishment in general, as an idea, is what makes these battles less meaningful. Because you win or lose a battle, it doesn't matter, because you're going to be able to recover very quickly, build new units very quickly. But with replenishment, you can take enormous casualties in a battle, and you don't care, because you'll recover from that, especially if you have good replenishment in your faction. But even if you don't have so great replenishment, you will keep going. Now, my idea with that isn't to nerf replenishment, rather I would see it removed. I actually found that playing battles in Rome Remastered felt a lot better. For all the pathfinding issues, the mediocre AI, for all those problems that Rome Remastered had, the battles themselves, even battles against minor settlements, even battles that I know I was going to win, felt significantly better than fighting a lot of battles here. That's because you couldn't just automatically replenish your units. Now I know it could get tiring if you had to manually replace units, but it also gives a player something to think about if they had to pay a price for it. So say for instance, you take some casualties in one of your own territories. Let's say for instance here, the Forest of the Moon have my recruitment structures, right? If I lost some units or a unit got damaged, it would cost me a bit to, let's say this unit was damaged to half, it would cost me a bit to replenish it, and I would have to do that manually. But if I lost a unit, or rather a unit got significantly damaged in, say, the Imperial Road, where I don't have the recruitment structures for the gutter runners, I could use global recruitment, or global replenishment, so to speak, to rebuild the ranks of a unit, but for a higher cost. I think that, at least as an idea, would make individual battles more meaningful. That's my perspective. Because then you would care about the individual battles, even if it's only from the perspective of trying to maintain your army cohesion as high as possible. When casualties matter, you do care about it, because that's something that I saw in Rome Remastered, and also in Ultimate General, again, which is based on Total War, where the casualties you took were significant. Now, what's interesting about that game is you couldn't fight any battle without losing an enormous number of troops. Sure, some battles could be curb stomps, but you'd still lose hundreds of units at least. But yeah, with proper tactics, you can minimize that. And that incentivized you as a player to care about proper tactics in a battle, on a battlefield, as opposed to just YOLOing it, so to speak. Because when each individual casualty matters and has an impact, then you do care about them more. Also in that game, you didn't have an infinite manpower pool. You had a limited manpower pool. Higher for the North, lower for the Confederates. Or higher for the Union, lower for the Confederates. And so each individual man that you sent, especially since getting trained replacements so units wouldn't lose ranks, would cost quite a bit of money. So consequences, there should be consequences to individual battles. And right now it doesn't feel like battles are really that consequential. Because you win a battle, let's say you take enormous casualties, but you win the battle, you've eliminated a major enemy threat, and you shouldn't just instantly have another enemy army coming against you. Like for instance here, in this campaign, I've killed, I'm at war with the northern provinces, and I've killed Miao Ying. I ambushed her, she was in a bad position, I ambushed her. That should be consequential to the campaign. I'm not saying like, oh, she should just recover instantly and just march another army against me. Like she should just instantly recruit an army in Nangao and come against me. No, that shouldn't matter. But right now the problem is, I pretty much have killed her because I ambushed her, only took a handful of casualties, which have already been replaced automatically with no effort, no consideration, no cost on myself. And therein lies the problem from my perspective. There's no consequences for it, or very few consequences for it, for either you or the AI. And those consequences should exist. Like if you're fighting a battle and losing a lot of men, or if the AI fights a battle and loses a lot of men, then there should be consequences to that. Instead, both you and the AI, and this is the best way to play the game, replenish your units incredibly quickly. So what's the consequence of that? Where are those consequences for fighting a difficult battle? What are the consequences for either you or the AI when you're fighting the minor settlement battles? Because there are none. The minor settlement battles, this is actually something that ties heavily into why they suck. Those minor settlement battles are irrelevant because even if you take some damage, you don't care unless there's an army close enough so that that turn, and only that turn, they actually get to strike you. Sure, your campaign might be slowed down, but individual minor settlement battles are inconsequential. Which, to be clear, was not the case in Rome or Medieval 2. I played a lot of Medieval 2, far more Medieval 2 than I've ever played any of the Warhammer games. And I can tell you, every single battle, every single delaying action by a garrison force mattered, because if I played my cards correctly in those settlement battles, I could inflict enormous losses. Now, with the exception of wiping out an entire unit, and even then that doesn't matter necessarily, with the exception of entire units potentially being wiped, the battles don't really matter. Like if I'm fighting a defense action in a settlement For instance, seeing Poe got attacked, yeah, I inflicted some casualties, and that did help me out eventually in the battle, but it was nowhere near significant. Some of the most memorable battles I had in Medieval 2 in particular were battles where I was vastly outnumbered. I was going to lose. Sometimes I won. Most of the time, yeah, you lost because the enemy had an overwhelming advantage. But it still was a battle. Those still were battles that meant something to my campaign because the AI couldn't just turn around and continue marching. It couldn't just instantly replenish and continue marching. Instead, it had to stop because if I play my cards right, I could inflict staggering losses on them, as opposed to what's going on right now. And this, again, is not just a case of AI, it's also a case for the player. And I think this is what needs to change. So, yeah, I would take the casualty replenishment system and throw it away completely. Would Creative Assembly do that? I'm not sure, but I do certainly think that we need a different system. I don't believe that just having low casualty replenishment would be a solution. That would just be frustrating, really. That would genuinely be frustrating. Or maybe it would just push you hard enough that enough to replace units. But then again, when that essentially end up being the same thing, where you're paying to replace the losses that you're taking in a battle. Just an idea, just a perspective. Or maybe we could have a system in place where we do have automatic casualty replenishment, but it's relatively low. Like, for instance, when a settlement gets damaged. Like, I think that's actually a really good comparison. I don't have one to show you here. But I think the situation where a settlement gets damaged is a really good example of how things can work in a more interesting way. Because, and to be clear, right now the game is still too heavily skewed from the perspective of you sacking settlements, and it shouldn't be. Like, if you take a settlement, if you just take it, you're doing something wrong. If you sack it and then take it, then or you loot and occupy it, that's generally going to be far better because you're going to gain tons and tons of money. Now, interestingly enough, that's not the case in Troy, a Total War Saga Troy, because in a Total War Saga Troy, you do that. Yeah, you'll get some resources from sacking a settlement, but you won't get the resources that you need to rebuild it. And crucially, when a structure gets damaged in all of these games, like in Warhammer, in Troy, in Free Kingdoms, though I can't say I remember much of Free Kingdoms, to be honest with you. When a structure gets damaged, it will slowly repair itself, or you can spend some money or some resources to repair it instantly. And maybe that's just a better system than what we currently have right now, where the only option to replenish losses without removing a unit is to, or merging units together, is to just wait. So I think there's some consideration that could be had there to make the battles more interesting. Some discussion could be had about the mechanics of the battles, the pathfinding in settlements, the siege tactics, the AI tactics, the etc, etc, etc. But I came into this video, what I realized is the difference between a quest battle, for instance, in this game that you can fight from the main menu and how little you care about that, versus a quest battle that you fight on your own. And I realized that that individual battles, unless there's some larger consequences on a campaign map, of which there are very few right now, but there's none whatsoever if you're fighting it from the main menu. But individual battles with few consequences are just going to be very insignificant, even if they're done very well. And that's the case in pretty much every strategy game like this. Like, for instance, in a game like Ultimate General, they spent a lot of time modeling the historical battles, but those battles feel far better when you're doing them in a campaign, and how well you do is important. It's not just about winning, it's about how well you win. Or you could even lose, and you could still continue the campaign. But how badly are you going to lose as well? That's a question. It feels like Total War is too much all or nothing, really. Either you win and you lose nothing, or you lose and you lose everything. And this applies for both the player and AI. And I think battles should be more consequential than that, and should be more nuanced in their outcomes than just that. That's all I had to say. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and I'll see you next time.